Robert Mitchell's weathered hands froze on his coffee mug, the steam rising like ghosts in the pre-dawn darkness of his Montana cabin. The creature he'd called his dog for 3 years stood silhouetted against the window, but the sound coming from its throat wasn't barking. It was a bone-chilling howl that made his blood run cold. The DNA test results, scattered across his kitchen table, told a truth that shattered everything. 85% gray wolf. His neighbor's frantic voice crackled through the radio. "Robert, something's killing livestock again. Jesus Christ, what is that thing?" The coffee mug slipped from Robert's arthritic fingers, shattering against the floor like his understanding of reality. Martha's favorite saying echoed in his mind. Love sees what it needs to see. But now her words felt like a cruel joke as he stared at the massive black predator he'd shared his bed with, trusted with his life. "Shadow," he whispered, his voice breaking. What had he been living with all this time? And who else knew the truth? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Robert Mitchell had always believed that loneliness was just another part of getting old, like arthritis in his joints or the way his heart skipped beats when he climbed the porch steps. At 68, he'd grown accustomed to the silence that filled his cabin like stagnant water, especially in the 18 months since Martha's heart had simply stopped beating one Tuesday morning while she was tending her tomatoes. The cabin sat on 5 acres of Montana wilderness, 3 miles from his nearest neighbor, where the isolation that once felt like freedom now pressed against him like a weight. His Social Security check of $1,847 arrived faithfully each month, barely covering the mortgage Martha had insisted they refinance to pay for her medical bills. $127,000 worth of treatments that couldn't save her anyway. The debt felt like a chain around his neck, reminding him daily that even love had a price tag in America. Every morning at 5, Robert would shuffle to the kitchen in his worn slippers, set 2 coffee cups on the counter out of habit, then quietly put one away. The routine had become sacred, a ritual of remembrance that kept Martha's presence alive in the small details. Her garden outside the window had grown wild without her touch. The tomatoes she'd loved now strangled by weeds, but Robert couldn't bring himself to pull them up. She could make anything bloom, he'd whisper to her photograph on the mantel, the same words he spoke every dawn. The loneliness might have consumed him entirely if not for Shadow, the massive black creature he'd found bleeding and broken on Highway 2 during that brutal winter 3 years ago. Robert had been driving back from town when his headlights caught the dark shape sprawled in the snow, and something in his mechanic's heart that knew how to fix broken things had pulled over. The animal was enormous, nearly 95 pounds of solid muscle beneath a coat blacker than Montana nights, with amber eyes that seemed to hold intelligence far beyond any dog Robert had ever known. Shadow didn't eat commercial dog food, only fresh meat that Robert drove 20 miles to town to buy, watching his grocery budget stretch thinner each month. The creature had strange habits, opening doors with careful pause, bringing Robert his heart medication when he forgot, positioning himself between Robert and any stranger who approached the property. Neighbors in Whitefish had whispered about the unusual dog, but Robert had defended him fiercely. "He's family," he'd tell anyone who questioned Shadow's breeding or behavior. Doc Harrison at the veterinary clinic had raised eyebrows about Shadow's size and predatory grace, but Robert had brushed off concerns. Martha used to say, "Love doesn't need words, Bobby. It just needs presence." And Shadow provided exactly that. A warm body that filled the silence, intelligent eyes that seemed to understand Robert's grief, and a loyalty that asked for nothing but gave everything. Now, staring at the DNA results scattered across his kitchen table like accusations, Robert realized he'd been living with a secret that could destroy them both. The morning of September 15th started like any other, with Robert setting out Shadow's breakfast of fresh venison he'd bought from Jake Morrison's hunting supply store. But Shadow turned away from the meat, something he'd never done in 3 years. The massive creature paced the cabin's perimeter with restless energy, his amber eyes scanning the tree line with an intensity that made Robert's skin crawl. "What's got into you, boy?" Robert murmured, but Shadow was already heading for the door, a low whine escaping his throat. Before Robert could stop him, the animal had pushed through the screen door and disappeared into the forest. 6 hours passed. Robert checked his watch every few minutes, anxiety gnawing at his chest like a familiar pain. Shadow had never left the property for more than an hour, and certainly never without Robert. As the afternoon sun began its descent behind the pines, Robert heard the soft padding of paws on the porch. Shadow stood at the door, but something was wrong. Fresh blood stained his black muzzle, and his eyes held a wildness Robert had never seen before. Following Shadow's trail into the woods, Robert discovered what had kept his companion away. 200 yards from the cabin, a white-tailed deer lay perfectly still, its throat torn with surgical precision. The kill was clean, professional, nothing like the messy work of domestic dogs Robert had seen before. This was how predators hunted, how wolves killed their prey with calculated efficiency. "Jesus Christ," Robert whispered, his hand trembling as he examined the carcass. "That ain't how dogs hunt." Shadow appeared beside him, sitting calmly as if waiting for approval. There was no guilt in his posture, no shame, only the satisfied bearing of a successful hunter. Robert's mind raced as he stared at the animal he thought he knew. The size, the intelligence, the strange behaviors that had always seemed just slightly off, pieces of a puzzle he'd been too blind to see. The next morning, Shadow's behavior became even more unsettling. He led Robert deeper into the forest, following game trails with purpose that suggested familiarity. Robert struggled to keep up, his arthritic knees protesting the rough terrain, but something in Shadow's demeanor demanded he follow. They walked for nearly an hour before Shadow stopped at what appeared to be a natural depression hidden beneath a canopy of ancient pines. Robert's breath caught in his throat. Scattered among the undergrowth were items that had no business being in the wilderness: a military-style backpack, torn pieces of clothing, and camping gear that looked like it had been arranged with deliberate care. Shadow sniffed at a small pink backpack, then looked at Robert with those amber eyes that seemed to communicate more than any words could. With shaking hands, Robert picked up the backpack. A name tag sewn into the fabric made his blood run cold. Emma Thompson. The Thompson family had disappeared 8 months ago during a camping trip in Glacier National Park. James Thompson, a forest ranger with 20 years of experience, his wife Sarah, a registered nurse, and their 2 children, Emma, 8, and Jake, 12, had vanished without a trace despite a massive search operation involving dozens of volunteers and professional rescue teams. Robert remembered the community meetings, the desperate pleas from James's fellow rangers, the way the whole town of Whitefish had rallied to search every ridge and valley. After 3 weeks, the official search had been called off. The assumption was that the family had fallen victim to the harsh Montana wilderness, a grizzly attack perhaps, or a fall into one of the many hidden crevasses that dotted the backcountry. But here was evidence that they'd been here, in this hidden valley that Shadow knew intimately. Robert's mind struggled to process the implications. Had Shadow found their bodies? Had he been guarding their remains all this time? The thought made Robert's stomach turn, but as he looked around the makeshift camp, he noticed something else. The gear was arranged not like a grave site, but like a living space. Someone had organized these supplies for survival. Shadow moved toward a cluster of boulders at the far end of the depression, his tail held high in the alert posture Robert had learned to recognize as his "pay attention" signal. Following the massive animal, Robert discovered what appeared to be the entrance to a natural cave, partially concealed by fallen branches that had been deliberately arranged to hide the opening. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't a grave site, it was a shelter. Someone had been living here, and Shadow had been protecting them. The missing Thompson family might not be dead at all. They might be alive, hidden in this remote valley, surviving with the help of the creature Robert had believed was his pet. As Shadow sat beside the cave entrance and fixed Robert with that intelligent stare, one thought echoed through the old man's mind. His companion had been keeping secrets far bigger than Robert had ever imagined. The drive to Doc Harrison's veterinary clinic in Whitefish felt like the longest 20 minutes of Robert's life. Shadow sat in the passenger seat of the old Ford pickup, his massive frame filling the space where Martha used to ride, amber eyes fixed on the road ahead with an alertness that now seemed less like intelligence and more like calculation. Robert's hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles went white, Martha's voice echoing in his memory. "Sometimes the truth we're not ready for finds us anyway, Bobby." Doc Harrison had been Whitefish's only veterinarian for 15 years, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd seen everything from calving complications to rattlesnake bites. Her clinic sat on the edge of town, a converted barn that still smelled faintly of hay despite decades of antiseptic and animal medicine. When Robert walked in with Shadow, Doc's eyebrows rose immediately. "Well, I'll be damned," she muttered, circling the examination table where Shadow sat with perfect stillness. "Robert, in all my years of practice, I've never seen a German Shepherd built quite like this one." Her practiced hands moved along Shadow's flanks, checking muscle tone and bone structure with the thoroughness that had made her reputation. Shadow allowed the examination without resistance, but Robert noticed how the animal's eyes tracked every movement, every instrument, with a wariness that spoke of intelligence far beyond normal canine capacity. "His snout's longer than breed standard," Doc observed, lifting Shadow's lips to examine his teeth. "And these canines, Jesus, Robert, these are built for tearing flesh, not chewing kibble." She paused, her fingers finding the thick muscle mass along Shadow's shoulders. "This animal's built like a predator, not a herding dog." Robert's mouth went dry. "What are you saying, Doc?" "I'm saying I'd like to run a genetic test," she replied, her voice careful and measured. "Something about Shadow's bone structure, his muscle composition, even the way he carries himself. It's not adding up to purebred German Shepherd. Maybe there's some wolf in his lineage or another breed we're not seeing." The word wolf hit Robert like a punch to the gut. He thought of the deer carcass, the professional kill, Shadow's strange behaviors that had always seemed just slightly wrong for a domestic dog. How long would a test take? 24 hours for a basic breed analysis, 48 for a comprehensive genetic breakdown. Doc Harrison's eyes met his with the kind of sympathy reserved for difficult diagnoses. "Robert, I've got to ask, where exactly did you find Shadow?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Robert had always been vague about Shadow's origins, claiming he'd found him as a stray. Now, faced with Doc's professional scrutiny, the lie felt heavier than truth. "Highway 2, winter of 21. He was hurt, bleeding. I couldn't just leave him there." "No identification? No collar or tags?" "Nothing. Just a scared, injured animal that needed help." Doc Harrison nodded slowly, but Robert could see the wheels turning behind her eyes. She'd treated enough abandoned animals to know the signs, and whatever she was seeing in Shadow didn't match the story of a lost pet. "Robert, I need to be straight with you. If this test comes back showing significant wolf content, I'm legally obligated to report it to the state wildlife department. Wolf hybrids are restricted in Montana, technically illegal without special permits. The words hit Robert like ice water. What does that mean? It means Shadow could be confiscated. Depending on the percentage of wolf DNA, he might be classified as wildlife rather than a domestic animal. The state doesn't take chances with predators, especially ones this size. Robert felt his world tilting on its axis. 3 years of companionship, 3 years of Shadow being the only thing that made the silence bearable. And now he faced the possibility of losing him to bureaucrats who saw only statistics and regulations. "Doc, this animal saved my life. After Martha died, if it wasn't for Shadow—" "I know, Robert. I've seen how much he means to you." Doc Harrison's voice was gentle but firm. "But if he's got significant wolf DNA, we're not just talking about a pet anymore. We're talking about a predator capable of killing a full-grown deer, living in close contact with humans. That's a liability the state won't ignore." As if understanding every word, Shadow's ears pricked forward, his amber eyes moving between Robert and Doc Harrison with an intelligence that suddenly seemed terrifying rather than endearing. The 48 hours waiting for Shadow's DNA results felt like a lifetime stretched on a rack. Robert barely slept, watching his companion move through their daily routines with new eyes, seeing predator where he'd once seen pet. Every graceful movement, every calculated pause at doorways, every amber glance now carried weight that made Robert's chest tight with anxiety. When Doc Harrison finally called on Thursday morning, her voice was strained with the kind of careful professionalism that preceded bad news. "Robert, you need to come in and bring Shadow." The drive to the clinic passed in silence, broken only by Shadow's occasional whine, as if the animal sensed the gravity of what awaited them. Doc Harrison met them at the door, her usual warm demeanor replaced by the clinical distance of someone delivering a diagnosis no one wanted to hear. 85% gray wolf, 15% domestic dog, she said without preamble, sliding the laboratory report across her desk. The numbers on the page seemed to pulse with accusation: canis lupus DNA markers, predator classifications, legal restrictions highlighted in bold red text. "Robert, this isn't a dog with some wolf ancestry. This is a wolf with just enough domestic breeding to make him marginally socialized to humans." Robert stared at the report until the letters blurred. 3 years of believing he'd rescued a dog, 3 years of companionship built on a fundamental misunderstanding of what Shadow truly was. What happens now? "I have to file this report with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks by close of business today. Once they process it, they'll send an agent to assess the situation." Doc Harrison's voice carried genuine regret. "Robert, given Shadow's size and predator capabilities, they're not going to let this slide. Best case scenario, they'll require you to obtain a permit that costs thousands of dollars annually and mandates specific containment facilities. Worst case—" She didn't need to finish. Robert had lived in Montana long enough to know how the state dealt with problem predators. The thought of Shadow in a cage, or worse, being euthanized because some bureaucrat deemed him dangerous, made Robert's heart hammer against his ribs with dangerous irregularity. That afternoon, Robert made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. Instead of waiting for government agents to arrive, he loaded his pickup with camping supplies and led Shadow back into the forest, following the same trail that had led them to the hidden valley. If his companion was truly a wolf, then perhaps it was time to learn what Shadow had been protecting all this time. The trek to the concealed cave took nearly 2 hours, Robert's arthritic knees screaming with each step over fallen logs and rocky terrain. Shadow moved with fluid grace, occasionally pausing to wait for his human companion, amber eyes holding patience that seemed almost maternal. When they reached the boulder formation that concealed the cave entrance, Shadow sat precisely where he had 3 days earlier, fixing Robert with that intelligent stare that now carried terrifying implications. "All right, boy," Robert whispered, his voice barely audible above the mountain wind. "Show me what you've been hiding." Shadow approached the cave entrance and released a sound Robert had never heard before. Not quite a howl, not quite a bark, but something primal that seemed to echo from the rocks themselves. The response came immediately. A man's voice, weak but unmistakably human, calling from within the darkness. "Shadow? Is that you, boy?" Robert's legs nearly gave out. The Thompson family was alive. What emerged from that cave over the next hour challenged everything Robert thought he knew about survival, loyalty, and the bonds between species. James Thompson crawled out first, his ranger's uniform torn and patched, his left leg clearly favoring an old injury. Behind him came Sarah, her nurse's training evident in the way she supported her husband while maintaining protective watch over their children. Emma, now 9 but looking older than her years, clung to a makeshift doll crafted from pine needles and cloth scraps. 12-year-old Jake moved with the careful awareness of a child who'd learned that the wilderness demanded constant vigilance. They were alive, but they were changed. 8 months of survival had transformed the Thompson family into something between human and wild, their movements economical and their eyes holding the alertness of prey animals. Sarah's medical background had kept them healthy, but it was Shadow, whom they called by his true name with reverence that bordered on worship, who had kept them alive. "The avalanche cut off our exit route on the second day," James explained, his voice hoarse from months of careful whisper conversations that wouldn't carry sound to predators. "We were trapped in this valley with winter coming on fast. That's when Shadow found us." Sarah picked up the narrative, her hands never stopping their constant inventory of her children's safety. "A grizzly came through our camp on the 3rd night. We thought we were dead, 300 pounds of bear between us and nowhere to run. Shadow appeared out of nowhere and faced that bear down. Didn't attack, didn't run, just stood his ground until the bear decided we weren't worth the trouble." The stories that followed painted a picture of survival orchestrated by intelligence that transcended species barriers. Shadow had led them to this hidden cave system, shown them which berries were safe to eat, brought them fresh kills when their strength waned during the brutal Montana winter. When Sarah had developed pneumonia in January, Shadow had somehow located and retrieved wild ginger root with antibiotic properties, dropping the healing plant at her feet with the precision of a trained pharmacist. "He saved us every single day," Emma whispered, her small hand buried deep in Shadow's thick fur. "When the bad men came looking, Shadow hid us until they went away." Robert's blood chilled. "Bad men?" James and Sarah exchanged a look heavy with significance. "Search and rescue teams weren't the only ones looking for us," James explained. "There were others, men who didn't identify themselves, didn't coordinate with official search efforts. They had equipment that seemed military grade, asked questions about what we might have seen before we disappeared." Sarah's voice dropped to barely audible. "James had been investigating some irregularities in backcountry permits before our camping trip, companies applying for access to restricted areas, conducting surveys without proper environmental oversight. He'd filed preliminary reports with his supervisor, but nothing had been acted upon yet. The implications hit Robert like a landslide. The Thompson family hadn't just been lost in the wilderness. They'd been hiding from people who had reasons to want them permanently missing. Shadow hadn't just been protecting them from natural predators. He'd been their guardian against human threats that operated outside the law. "We tried to signal for help twice," Jake added, his young voice carrying the weight of experiences no child should bear. "Shadow stopped us both times. The first time, he led us away just hours before those unmarked helicopters started circling the area. The second time, he actually blocked the cave entrance until the search teams passed by." Robert stared at Shadow with new understanding. The animal's intelligence wasn't just remarkable, it was tactical. Somehow Shadow had assessed threats and made calculated decisions about when safety lay in hiding rather than rescue. The wolf had been conducting a sophisticated protection operation, keeping the family alive while shielding them from dangers they couldn't even identify. "We've been planning to try reaching civilization again," Sarah said, "but we needed to wait until we were sure it was safe. Shadow seems to think that time is coming soon." As if responding to his name, Shadow moved to Robert's side and pressed his massive head against the old man's leg. The gesture, once interpreted as simple affection, now carried the weight of communication between intelligence that operated on levels Robert was only beginning to comprehend. Shadow had brought Robert here not just to reveal the Thompson family's survival, but to entrust him with their protection. The sun was setting behind the mountains when Robert finally spoke the words that would change all their lives. "We're going to get you home, all of us, together." But even as he made the promise, Robert knew that bringing the Thompson family back to civilization would expose Shadow's true nature to a world that saw wolves as threats to be eliminated rather than guardians to be protected. The very act of rescue would likely result in Shadow's death sentence, a cruel irony that twisted Robert's heart with impossible choices. Shadow seemed to understand the dilemma. As darkness settled over the hidden valley, the wolf positioned himself at the cave entrance, amber eyes scanning the tree line with vigilance that had protected this family for 8 months. He was prepared to continue his guardianship for as long as necessary, even if it meant remaining hidden forever. Robert realized he was facing the most important decision of his life: how to save the family. Shadow had protected without destroying the wolf who had become his own reason for living. The plan Robert devised during that sleepless night in the cave was born from desperation and fueled by a stubborn refusal to accept that love and law couldn't coexist. While the Thompson family slept huddled together in the deepest part of the cave, Robert sat beside Shadow, whispering his strategy to the wolf whose amber eyes seemed to understand every word. They would bring the family out, but not through official channels. Instead, Robert would contact his nephew Danny, a paramedic in Kalispell, who could provide medical assessment without triggering the bureaucratic machinery that would inevitably lead to Shadow's exposure. The trek out of the hidden valley the next morning tested everyone's limits. James Thompson's injured leg, weakened by months of inadequate healing, gave out twice on the steep terrain. Sarah's nursing instincts kicked in as she fashioned a makeshift crutch from a fallen branch, but it was Shadow who solved the mobility problem with intelligence that left Robert speechless. The wolf positioned himself beside James, allowing the forest ranger to steady himself against Shadow's powerful frame while maintaining the animal's ability to scout for threats ahead. Emma and Jake moved like children who'd learned that survival depended on silence and awareness. They communicated through hand signals Sarah had taught them, their young faces carrying the gravity of experience that should have belonged to adults. Shadow maintained constant patrol around the group, ranging ahead to check their path, then circling back to ensure no one had fallen behind. His movements were systematic, purposeful, the tactics of a protector who'd been conducting this mission for 8 months. The journey to Robert's cabin took 6 hours, including frequent rest stops that Shadow seemed to anticipate before the humans realized they needed them. When they finally emerged from the tree line and saw Robert's modest home, Sarah Thompson broke down in tears that 8 months of survival had never allowed her to shed. The sight of electric lights, the smell of wood smoke from the chimney, the simple promise of warmth and safety. It overwhelmed defenses that had kept her family alive, but had also kept them from acknowledging their trauma. Robert immediately called his nephew Danny, speaking in the careful code they'd developed during Robert's own health scares. "Danny, I need you to come up to the cabin. Bring your medical kit and don't ask questions until you get here." "And son, This conversation never happened unless I say otherwise. Danny arrived within 2 hours, his paramedic training allowing him to assess the Thompson family's condition without the formalities that would have triggered missing persons reports. Physically, they were in remarkable shape considering their ordeal. Sarah's medical background had prevented malnutrition and infection, while Shadow's hunting had provided adequate protein. But the psychological impact was evident in their hypervigilance, their instinctive positioning near exits, and the way they unconsciously arranged themselves so Shadow could maintain protective oversight of the group. They need proper medical evaluation and psychological counseling, Danny told Robert privately, while the family rested in the cabin's main room. But Robert, if I report this through official channels, there's going to be a federal investigation. Missing persons cases that last 8 months with no trace don't just get resolved quietly. Robert nodded, having anticipated this complication. What if they were never actually missing? What if they'd been staying with a relative, out of contact but safe? Danny raised his eyebrows. You're talking about falsifying medical records, Uncle Robert. If this comes out wrong, I could lose my license. And if it comes out right, 4 people get their lives back without destroying the creature that saved them. The ethical complexity of the situation weighed heavily on everyone involved. James Thompson, despite his gratitude for Shadow's protection, understood the legal implications of his family's disappearance better than anyone. As a forest ranger, he'd been part of the massive search operation that had consumed thousands of dollars in resources and man-hours. His reappearance would trigger investigations that could expose not only Shadow's true nature, but also the reasons his family had initially hidden from their supposed rescuers. There are people who wanted us to stay missing, James explained to Robert and Danny during a hushed conversation while his family slept. The backcountry permits I was investigating involved companies with connections to extractive industries that operate in regulatory gray areas. My disappearance effectively ended that investigation. Sarah added her perspective with the clinical clarity of someone whose medical training had taught her to face harsh realities. If we return claiming we were lost and survived on our own, it'll be a miracle story that brings media attention we can't afford. If we return claiming we were hiding, it'll trigger investigations that could put Shadow at risk and expose the people who wanted us gone in the first place. The solution, when it finally emerged, came from an unexpected source. Shadow himself seemed to understand the dilemma facing his extended pack. Late that evening, as Robert sat on his porch struggling with impossible choices, Shadow approached and placed something at his feet. A military-style dog tag, weathered and partially illegible, but clearly indicating some form of service record. Robert turned the tag over in his weathered hands, making out fragments of text. Alpha 7, K9 Unit, Afghanistan 2019. The implications hit him like lightning. Shadow wasn't just a wolf hybrid. He was a veteran, a former military working dog whose service record might provide legal protection that civilian pet ownership never could. The phone call Robert made that night changed everything. Using directory assistance and the kind of persistent charm that came from decades of small-town relationships, he tracked down information about K9 units that had operated in Afghanistan during the time frame indicated on Shadow's tag. The trail led him to Sergeant Mike Sullivan, a former handler who'd been discharged from the Army 18 months earlier and was now living in Missoula, Montana, less than 200 miles away. "Sir, you said you found a large black dog with military tags?" Mike's voice carried exhaustion mixed with desperate hope. "Can you describe any unusual behaviors? Does he respond to tactical commands?" Robert described Shadow's intelligence, his protective instincts, his ability to assess threats and make strategic decisions. With each detail, Mike's breathing became more labored, as if he were fighting back emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. Mr. Mitchell, the dog you're describing sounds like my partner, Alpha 7. We called him Phoenix because he seemed to come back from impossible situations. He disappeared during our final mission in Afghanistan when our convoy was ambushed. I've been searching for him ever since. The story that emerged during their 2-hour phone conversation painted a picture of loyalty that transcended species and geography. Mike had gone AWOL from his base in Colorado, using his military savings to conduct a private search operation that had taken him across 3 states. He'd been living in his truck for months, following leads that inevitably turned into dead ends, driven by guilt over losing his partner and love that wouldn't accept that Phoenix was gone forever. The military wrote him off as KIA, Mike explained, his voice breaking. But I knew he was alive. Phoenix was too smart to die in some foreign desert. I just never imagined he'd find his way to Montana. Robert felt pieces of an impossible puzzle clicking into place. Shadow's tactical awareness, his ability to assess threats, his sophisticated understanding of protection protocols. These weren't just wolf instincts enhanced by domestic breeding, they were military training combined with lupine intelligence, creating a guardian whose capabilities exceeded anything nature had originally designed. But Mike's arrival would bring complications that Robert wasn't prepared to face. As Phoenix's official handler, Mike had legal claims to Shadow that superseded Robert's emotional attachment. More dangerously, Mike's military connection could expose the Thompson family's situation to the very authorities they'd been hiding from. The federal investigation that James feared could be triggered by Mike's presence, especially if military officials decided to reclaim a valuable asset they'd presumed lost. As dawn broke over the Montana mountains, Robert realized that saving Shadow and protecting the Thompson family would require sacrifices that none of them were prepared to make. The arrival of Mike Sullivan would force everyone to choose between legal safety and moral obligation, between the bonds they'd formed and the laws they were supposed to obey. Shadow seemed to sense the approaching crisis. He positioned himself at the cabin's front window, amber eyes fixed on the horizon with the alertness of a sentinel expecting either salvation or siege. The wolf who had protected his pack for 8 months understood that their greatest test was yet to come. Mike Sullivan arrived at Robert's cabin just as the morning mist was lifting from the valley, driving a battered pickup truck that looked like it had covered every mile between Montana and Afghanistan twice over. When he stepped out of the vehicle, Robert saw a young man aged beyond his 32 years, hollow-cheeked and haunted, wearing civilian clothes that hung loose on a frame that had clearly lost significant weight. But the moment Shadow appeared at the cabin door, Mike's transformation was instantaneous and heartbreaking. "Phoenix," Mike whispered, his voice cracking like ice on a warm day. Shadow's reaction was equally profound. The wolf's entire body went rigid for a heartbeat, then began trembling with recognition and suppressed emotion. He moved toward Mike with careful steps, as if approaching a ghost he wasn't sure was real. When Mike dropped to his knees and opened his arms, Shadow, Phoenix, launched himself into his former handler's embrace with a whine that sounded like 3 years of accumulated grief finally finding voice. Robert watched the reunion from his porch, feeling his heart break and mend simultaneously. The bond between soldier and war dog was unmistakable, forged in combat zones where trust meant survival and loyalty transcended the barriers between species. But as beautiful as the moment was, Robert knew it carried implications that threatened everything they'd built together. 18 months, Mike said through tears, his face buried in Phoenix's thick fur. 18 months I've been looking for you, boy. I thought you were dead. I thought I'd failed you. His voice carried the weight of guilt that had driven him across 3 states, sleeping in his truck and spending his military savings on a search that everyone else had declared hopeless. The story Mike told over coffee in Robert's kitchen painted a picture of devotion that bordered on obsession. Phoenix had been more than a military working dog. He'd been Mike's partner in counter-terrorism operations, his emotional anchor in a war zone where death was random and friendship was the only defense against psychological breakdown. When their convoy had been ambushed outside Kandahar, Mike had been thrown clear of the explosion that killed 3 soldiers and wounded 6 others. In the chaos that followed, Phoenix had simply vanished. "I woke up in a field hospital 3 days later," Mike explained, his hands shaking as he held his coffee cup. "First thing I asked about was Phoenix. They told me he was listed as missing, presumed killed in action. But I knew better. Phoenix was too smart to die in some roadside bomb. He'd have found a way out." Mike's subsequent actions had cost him his military career and nearly his sanity. He'd gone AWOL during his medical leave, using forged documents to return to Afghanistan for an unauthorized search operation. When military police finally tracked him down, he'd been arrested, court-martialed, and dishonorably discharged. But even prison hadn't stopped his search for Phoenix. Upon his release, he'd liquidated his savings and begun following every lead, no matter how thin, that might reunite him with his lost partner. "I've been living in my truck for 8 months, Mike admitted, his voice hollow with exhaustion, following reports of large dogs, wolf sightings, anything that might be Phoenix. I was down to my last $100 when your call came in." The Thompson family listened to Mike's story with growing understanding of the sacrifice that love sometimes demanded. They'd spent 8 months learning that survival often required choices that looked insane from the outside, and Mike's dedication to finding Phoenix resonated with their own experience of loyalty transcending logic. But as the morning progressed, the practical implications of Mike's arrival became impossible to ignore. As Phoenix's former handler, Mike had documentation that proved the wolf's military service and training. More importantly, he had contacts within the veteran community who might provide legal avenues for protecting Phoenix from state wildlife authorities. However, his presence also attracted exactly the kind of federal attention that the Thompson family had been hiding from. The crisis crystallized when Sheriff Janet Miller arrived at Robert's cabin just after noon, responding to reports of suspicious activity that had been called in by Robert's neighbor, Mrs. Hensley. The elderly woman had noticed the unusual gathering of vehicles and people at Robert's normally quiet property and had called authorities out of concern for his welfare. "Robert, what's going on here?" Sheriff Miller asked, her experienced eyes taking in the scene. Mike's obvious military bearing, the Thompson family's nervous positioning near exits, and Phoenix's alert posture that suggested he was prepared for immediate action. "Mrs. Hensley said there's been a lot of activity, and frankly, some folks in town are asking questions about that large dog of yours." Robert felt the walls closing in around them. Sheriff Miller was a good woman who'd known him for decades, but she was also a law enforcement officer with obligations that superseded personal relationships. If she discovered the Thompson family's true situation, she'd be legally required to report their reappearance, triggering the federal investigation that James had been desperately trying to avoid. Mike stepped forward, his military training asserting itself in the crisis. "Sheriff, I'm former Sergeant Mike Sullivan, and this is my military working dog, Phoenix. I've been searching for him since he went missing during our deployment in Afghanistan. Mr. Mitchell here was kind enough to care for Phoenix until I could locate him." The explanation sounded reasonable on the surface, but Sheriff Miller's 20 years of law enforcement had taught her to recognize the smell of half-truths. Her eyes moved between the assembled group, noting the Thompson family's obvious discomfort and the way Phoenix positioned himself to maintain visual contact with all potential threats. "Mr. Sullivan, do you have documentation proving this animal's military service?" she asked, her tone professional but skeptical. "Because I've had reports that this dog might be a wolf hybrid, which would make ownership illegal in Montana without special permits." Mike produced Phoenix's military identification documents, which clearly established the animal's service record and veteran status. But Sheriff Miller's attention had shifted to the Thompson family, particularly the children, whose faces she was beginning to recognize despite their changed appearance after 8 months of wilderness survival. "James Thompson?" she said slowly, her voice filled with growing recognition. "Sarah, my God, where have you been? The entire state has been looking for you. You were declared missing 8 months ago after your camping trip." The moment Sheriff Miller spoke their names, Robert knew their carefully constructed plan was falling apart. The Thompson family's disappearance had been one of the biggest news stories in Montana, involving multiple agencies and thousands of volunteer hours. Their sudden reappearance would trigger exactly the kind of media attention and federal investigation that could expose the reasons they'd been hiding, potentially putting them in greater danger than they'd faced in the wilderness. Phoenix seemed to sense the escalating tension. He moved to position himself between the Thompson family and Sheriff Miller, his body language shifting from calm alertness to protective readiness. The wolf's tactical training was asserting itself, recognizing a potential threat to his pack and preparing to respond with whatever force might be necessary. Robert realized they were standing at the precipice of disaster, where 3 different sets of obligations, legal, moral, and emotional, were about to collide with devastating consequences for everyone he'd come to love. What happened next unfolded with the brutal efficiency of a nightmare that had been 18 months in the making. Before Sheriff Miller could process the full implications of the Thompson family's miraculous reappearance, the sound of approaching vehicles cut through the mountain air like a chainsaw through silence. 3 black SUVs with government plates crested the hill leading to Robert's cabin, moving with the purposeful coordination of a federal task force that had been tracking their target for far longer than anyone realized. "Everybody stay calm," Sheriff Miller commanded, her hand instinctively moving toward her service weapon as she recognized the unmistakable signature of a federal operation. But Phoenix had already assessed the threat level and made his tactical decision. The wolf positioned himself between the approaching vehicles and his pack, his massive frame coiled with the controlled violence of a predator prepared to defend his territory at any cost. The lead SUV's door opened, and Dr. Elena Rodriguez stepped out with the bearing of someone accustomed to absolute authority in crisis situations. At 52, she carried herself with the clinical precision of a military scientist, her steel-gray hair pulled back severely and her dark eyes scanning the scene with the efficiency of someone evaluating assets and liabilities. Behind her emerged a team of federal agents whose tactical gear and tranquilizer equipment made their intentions unmistakably clear. "Mr. Mitchell," Dr. Rodriguez called out, her voice carrying across the clearing with the kind of projected authority that demanded compliance. "I'm Dr. Elena Rodriguez, Director of Specialized Canine Operations for the Department of Defense. You are harboring a classified military asset that belongs to the United States government." Robert felt his world tilting on its axis as the full scope of what they were facing became clear. This wasn't just about Shadow's wolf DNA or the Thompson family's disappearance. They were caught in the machinery of federal bureaucracy that saw Phoenix not as a living being deserving of retirement and peace, but as government property that had been unlawfully retained by civilians. Mike stepped forward, his military bearing asserting itself despite the civilian clothes and months of desperate searching. "Ma'am, I'm former Sergeant Mike Sullivan, Phoenix's handler during our deployment in Afghanistan. This animal was listed as KIA after our convoy was ambushed. Mr. Mitchell found him injured and provided care that saved his life." Dr. Rodriguez's expression shifted slightly as she recognized Mike, but her response carried no warmth of reunion. "Sergeant Sullivan, you were dishonorably discharged after going AWOL to conduct an unauthorized search operation You have no legal standing in this matter, and your presence here constitutes interference with federal property recovery." The clinical coldness of her words hit like physical blows. Phoenix wasn't being welcomed home as a returning hero. He was being repossessed like a piece of equipment that had been temporarily misplaced. Robert watched as federal agents began setting up a perimeter around his property, their movements suggesting this was a well-rehearsed operation that had been planned for far longer than the 48 hours since Doc Harrison's report. "How long have you known?" Robert asked, his voice carrying the weight of betrayal as he realized the scope of the surveillance they'd been under. "How long have you been watching us?" Dr. Rodriguez consulted a tablet that appeared to contain detailed surveillance reports. Phoenix's location was flagged when he was involved in a conflict with a grizzly bear 6 months ago. A wildlife camera captured footage of the encounter, and our facial recognition software identified him as Alpha 7. We've been monitoring this situation ever since, waiting for the optimal moment for recovery. The revelation hit everyone simultaneously. They'd been living under federal observation for months, their every move cataloged and analyzed by people who saw Phoenix as a strategic asset rather than a family member. The Thompson family's hidden survival, Robert's emotional recovery, Mike's desperate search, all of it had been nothing more than data points in a government file. Sarah Thompson found her voice first, her nursing background giving her the clinical vocabulary to challenge Dr. Rodriguez's authority. "This animal saved my family's lives. He's been protecting us for 8 months, keeping us alive when your government search operations failed to find us. You want to repossess the creature who did what your entire system couldn't accomplish?" "Doctor." Rodriguez's response revealed the personal motivation that drove her clinical exterior. "Mrs. Thompson, I understand your gratitude, but you don't comprehend what Phoenix represents. He's not just a highly trained military working dog, he's the product of a specialized breeding program that cost the taxpayers $12 million. His combat effectiveness, his survival instincts, his ability to operate independently, these capabilities could save thousands of military lives if properly utilized." The truth behind Dr. Rodriguez's obsession began to emerge as she continued her justification. "My son, Marcus Rodriguez, was killed in Afghanistan 3 years ago when his unit encountered an IED without proper K-9 support. If Phoenix had been assigned to that sector, if we'd had more assets like him available, Marcus would be alive today." The personal tragedy underlying the federal operation added a layer of complexity that made the moral landscape even more treacherous. "Doctor." Rodriguez wasn't just a cold bureaucrat reclaiming government property. She was a grieving mother who believed that Phoenix's continued military service could prevent other families from experiencing her loss. But Mike Sullivan had lived through enough military operations to recognize the difference between official policy and personal vendetta. "Ma'am, with respect, Phoenix has served his country with distinction. He's earned retirement, earned the right to choose his own life. Look at him. He's healthy, he's happy, he's formed bonds with people who love him. Isn't that what we're supposed to be fighting for?" Dr. Rodriguez's response came with the cold precision of someone who had rehearsed this argument many times in her own mind. "Sergeant, Phoenix's emotional attachment to civilians is precisely what makes him a security risk. He possesses classified knowledge of military tactics and operational procedures. His loyalty has been compromised by domestic conditioning." As if understanding every word of the conversation, Phoenix moved to a position that allowed him to maintain visual contact with all the federal agents while keeping his pack, Robert, Mike, and the Thompson family, behind him. His tactical positioning was flawless, the product of training that had kept soldiers alive in the world's most dangerous places. Sheriff Miller attempted to assert local authority in a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond her jurisdiction. Dr. Rodriguez, this is still Montana, and we have our own laws regarding animal welfare and property rights. Mr. Mitchell has cared for this animal for 3 years. That establishes custodial rights that can't be ignored. Sheriff, federal law supersedes state jurisdiction in matters of national security, Dr. Rodriguez replied, signaling to her team to begin the capture operation. Phoenix will be returned to active duty where his capabilities can serve the greater good. The greater good. The phrase hung in the mountain air like smoke from a funeral pyre, reducing Phoenix's individual worth to a calculation of utilitarian benefit. Robert felt something break inside his chest as he watched federal agents approach with tranquilizer equipment, their movements suggesting this confrontation would end with Phoenix unconscious and transported back to a life of warfare and violence. But the Thompson family had spent 8 months learning that survival sometimes required fighting for what mattered most, regardless of the odds against success. James Thompson stepped forward, his forest ranger authority lending weight to his words despite the circumstances. Dr. Rodriguez, as a federal employee with 20 years of service, I'm filing an official complaint regarding this operation. Phoenix saved 4 American lives through independent action when government resources failed. His heroism deserves recognition, not punishment. Dr. Rodriguez's tablet chimed with an incoming message that made her expression shift from confident authority to barely controlled frustration. "There's been a development," she announced, her voice tight with suppressed anger. "It appears that Phoenix's military service record has been submitted for review by the Congressional Committee on Veteran Affairs. Someone has filed paperwork requesting that he be classified as a veteran rather than equipment." Mike Sullivan's grin was the first genuine smile Robert had seen from the young veteran since his arrival. "Ma'am, I may have been dishonorably discharged, but I still have friends in the veteran community. Phoenix has served his country with distinction. He deserves the same consideration we give to human veterans who've completed their service." The federal operation that had seemed unstoppable minutes earlier was now complicated by political oversight that Dr. Rodriguez clearly hadn't anticipated. Congressional review meant media attention, public scrutiny, and the kind of political complications that made bureaucrats nervous about aggressive enforcement actions. But as the afternoon shadows lengthened across Robert's property, everyone present understood that paperwork and political maneuvering were only temporary obstacles to Dr. Rodriguez's determination. Whether through official channels or bureaucratic maneuvering, she would eventually succeed in reclaiming Phoenix for military service. The wolf seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. As federal agents maintained their perimeter and Dr. Rodriguez coordinated with her superiors via secure communication, Phoenix moved through his pack with the deliberate purpose of someone saying goodbye. He nuzzled Emma Thompson's hand, pressed his massive head against Sarah's leg, and finally approached Robert with the kind of gentle dignity that had characterized their 3 years together. Looking into Phoenix's amber eyes, Robert realized they were facing the cruelest irony of all. The creature who had saved them all would be destroyed by the very system he had served so faithfully. The transformation in Dr. Elena Rodriguez began with a phone call that arrived just as federal agents were preparing their tranquilizer equipment. Her secure satellite phone buzzed with the distinctive tone reserved for priority communications from Washington, and her confident expression shifted to barely concealed frustration as she listened to whoever was on the other end. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes, but Robert could see her entire operation unraveling with each terse exchange. "Stand down," Dr. Rodriguez commanded her team, her voice tight with suppressed anger. "We have a 48-hour hold on all enforcement actions pending congressional review." The reprieve felt like oxygen to drowning lungs, but Robert knew it was temporary. Congressional committees moved slowly, and Dr. Rodriguez's determination hadn't wavered. It had simply been delayed by political bureaucracy that she would eventually find ways to circumvent. As her federal team began packing their equipment with obvious reluctance, Robert caught sight of something that would change everything. Dr. Rodriguez pulling a worn photograph from her jacket pocket, staring at it with an expression of profound loss before quickly tucking it away. That evening, after the federal agents had established a surveillance perimeter but withdrawn to a respectful distance, an unexpected visitor arrived at Robert's cabin. Dr. Rodriguez came alone, without her tactical gear or official authority, carrying herself like a woman who had reached the end of a very long road. She knocked on Robert's door just after sunset, her professional composure replaced by something rawer and more human. "Mr. Mitchell, may I come in? I'd like to speak with you privately." Robert led her to his kitchen, the same space where he'd shared coffee with Martha every morning for 42 years, where he'd processed the DNA results that had shattered his understanding of Phoenix's identity. Dr. Rodriguez sat heavily in Martha's chair, her hands trembling slightly as she accepted the coffee Robert offered. "My son Marcus would have been 25 this week," she began, her voice carrying the weight of grief that had been compressed into professional determination for 3 years. "He died in Afghanistan when his patrol encountered an IED. No canine support was available that day because of resource allocation failures, bureaucratic decisions that prioritized equipment over lives." She pulled out the photograph Robert had glimpsed earlier, placing it carefully on the table. Marcus Rodriguez had been a handsome young man with his mother's dark eyes and a smile that suggested he'd inherited none of her clinical detachment. He wore his Army uniform with obvious pride, and Robert could see the resemblance to Dr. Rodriguez in the stubborn set of his jaw. "After Marcus died, I threw myself into developing better canine programs," she continued, her voice growing stronger as she found her narrative rhythm. "Phoenix represented everything I thought we needed: superior intelligence, enhanced physical capabilities, unwavering loyalty to military objectives. I convinced myself that creating more assets like Phoenix would prevent other mothers from losing their sons." The personal motivation behind her obsession was finally becoming clear. But Dr. Rodriguez wasn't finished with her revelation. She reached into her jacket and withdrew a sealed envelope, yellowed with age and bearing Marcus's distinctive handwriting. "This was his last letter," she said, sliding the envelope across the table to Robert. "I couldn't read it for 2 years after his death. When I finally opened it, I discovered something that changed my understanding of what Marcus actually believed about service and sacrifice." Robert opened the letter with trembling hands, recognizing the careful penmanship of a young man who had taken time to choose his words thoughtfully. The letter was dated just 3 days before Marcus's death, and its contents were devastating in their simple humanity. "Mom, I know you worry about me over here, but I want you to know that I've learned something important about what it means to serve. Yesterday, our unit was assigned a K-9 team for a reconnaissance mission. The dog's name was Ranger, and watching him work with his handler made me understand that the best partnerships aren't about control or training. They're about mutual trust and respect. Ranger wasn't just following orders. He was protecting people he loved, and that love made him more effective than any amount of military conditioning could have achieved. When I get home, I want to get a dog, Mom. Not for security or status, but because I want to learn what unconditional love actually feels like. I think that's what we're really fighting for over here, the right to love freely and be loved in return." The letter continued with Marcus describing his plans for after the war, his hopes for starting a family, his desire to become a veterinarian so he could help heal rather than harm. But the final paragraph was what broke Robert's heart completely. "I've been thinking about Dad a lot lately, and how he always said that the measure of a man isn't how well he follows orders, but how well he protects the things that can't protect themselves. If something happens to me over here, I don't want you to spend your life trying to create perfect soldiers. I want you to help broken ones heal. There's enough violence in the world, Mom. What we need more of is love. Doctor. Rodriguez was crying now, tears that had been held back by 3 years of professional focus finally finding release. I've spent 3 years dishonoring Marcus's memory, she whispered. He would have hated what I've done to Phoenix, what I've tried to turn him into. The revelation transformed the entire dynamic of the federal operation. Dr. Rodriguez wasn't just a bureaucrat reclaiming government property. She was a grieving mother who had finally confronted the fact that her quest for perfect military assets had betrayed everything her son had actually valued. Phoenix has found exactly what Marcus wanted for himself, she continued, her voice growing stronger with conviction. He's found a family that loves him, a purpose that doesn't involve violence, a chance to heal instead of harm. How can I destroy that in Marcus's name when it's everything Marcus believed in? Robert reached across the table and took Dr. Rodriguez's hand in his weathered grip. Elena, Phoenix saved the Thompson family because he chose love over duty. That's not a security risk. That's the highest form of service there is. The conversation that followed lasted until well past midnight, as Dr. Rodriguez processed 3 years of misdirected grief and began to understand how she could honor Marcus's memory in ways that created healing rather than perpetuating violence. She had the authority to reclassify Phoenix's status, to officially retire him from military service with full veteran benefits and legal protection from state wildlife authorities. But more than bureaucratic solutions, Dr. Rodriguez found something she hadn't expected when she'd arrived at Robert's cabin. A path toward redemption that Marcus would have recognized and approved. Instead of creating more efficient weapons, she could use her position to help military working dogs transition to civilian life, establishing retirement programs that honored their service while allowing them to find peace. There are hundreds of military working dogs nearing the end of their service careers, she explained to Robert as they finalized their agreement. Most of them are euthanized or warehoused in military facilities because there's no system for helping them transition to civilian life. Phoenix could be the model for a new approach, proof that these animals can heal and thrive when they're treated as veterans rather than equipment. As dawn broke over the Montana mountains, Dr. Rodriguez signed the paperwork that officially retired Phoenix from military service and established him as the first beneficiary of what would become known as the Marcus Rodriguez Veteran K-9 Transition Program. Phoenix would retain his military rank and honors while gaining the legal status of a service animal, protecting him from state wildlife restrictions and ensuring his care for the remainder of his life. But perhaps more importantly, Dr. Rodriguez had found a way to transform her grief into something constructive, channeling her authority and resources toward healing rather than creating more efficient methods of warfare. The federal agents who had arrived to capture Phoenix would instead begin developing protocols for identifying and retiring military working dogs who could benefit from civilian placement. Standing on Robert's porch as the sun painted the valley in shades of gold and crimson, Dr. Rodriguez watched Phoenix playing gently with Emma Thompson, his massive frame demonstrating the careful control that made him safe around children despite his predatory capabilities. "Marcus would have loved this," she said softly, her voice carrying peace that had eluded her for 3 years. "He always said the best warriors know when to stop fighting." Phoenix seemed to understand that the crisis had passed. He approached Dr. Rodriguez with the same careful dignity he'd shown everyone throughout the ordeal, allowing her to scratch behind his ears while his amber eyes held forgiveness for someone who had finally found her way home. 6 months later, on a crisp March morning that carried the promise of spring in the Montana air, Robert Mitchell stood on his expanded porch watching the most beautiful sight he'd witnessed in his 78 years of life. Phoenix moved through the meadow behind the cabin with fluid grace, No longer the haunted war veteran who'd arrived broken and bleeding 3 years earlier, but a confident guardian overseeing what had become an extended family that defied every conventional definition of the word. The cabin itself had been transformed with help from the Whitefish community, expanded to accommodate the Thompson family who had decided to make Montana their permanent home. James had accepted a position with the National Park Service, his experience with wilderness survival making him invaluable for search and rescue operations. Sarah had established a practice as a trauma counselor, her 8 months of survival experience giving her unique insights into resilience and recovery. Emma and Jake attended the local school, where their stories of surviving in the wilderness with Phoenix's protection had made them minor celebrities among their classmates. But the most remarkable transformation belonged to Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who had relocated from Washington, D.C. to establish the Marcus Rodriguez Veteran K-9 Transition Center just outside Whitefish. The facility, built on land donated by the community, served as both a retirement home for military working dogs and a training center for civilian families interested in adopting these remarkable animals. Elena had traded her government suits for flannel shirts and hiking boots, finding more satisfaction in healing traumatized veterans, both human and canine, than she'd ever experienced in her former position developing military assets. Mike Sullivan had become the center's lead trainer, his expertise with Phoenix proving invaluable in helping other military working dogs adapt to civilian life. His PTSD, which had driven him to desperate searches across 3 states, had found purpose in helping both animals and their new families navigate the complex transition from warfare to peaceful domesticity. The nightmares that had plagued him for months gradually faded as he discovered that healing others could heal himself. Phoenix's role in this new community was unlike anything the military had ever envisioned when they designed their breeding programs. He served as a mentor to newly retired military working dogs, demonstrating through example that intelligence trained for warfare could be redirected toward protection and companionship. His interactions with traumatized animals were gentle but authoritative, showing them that submission to humans didn't require abandoning their dignity or strength. The success of the Marcus Rodriguez Center had attracted national attention, leading to legislation that established similar facilities across the country. The Phoenix Act, named in honor of the wolf who had catalyzed this transformation, mandated retirement programs for military working dogs and provided funding for their transition to civilian life. Elena testified before Congress, sharing Marcus's letter and Phoenix's story as evidence that America's obligation to its veterans extended beyond the human members of military units. Robert's daily routine had evolved to accommodate his role as an unofficial grandfather to the extended family that now called his property home. His mornings began with coffee shared with Elena, who had moved into a small cabin on the adjacent property, their conversations ranging from memories of their respective losses to plans for expanding the center's programs. Phoenix would join them on the porch, his massive head resting against Robert's leg in a gesture of contentment that never failed to warm the old man's heart. The financial struggles that had once kept Robert awake at night had been resolved through an unexpected source. The documentary about Phoenix's story had generated enough revenue to pay off Martha's medical debts and establish a trust fund for the center's ongoing operations. Phoenix's Pack, as the film was titled, had won several awards and inspired similar rescue operations across the country, proving that one story of love and loyalty could ripple outward to create systemic change. Sheriff Janet Miller often stopped by for coffee, her initial skepticism about the unusual arrangement having evolved into deep respect for what the community had accomplished. The federal investigation she'd once feared had become a model for other jurisdictions dealing with similar situations, demonstrating that creative solutions could honor both legal obligations and moral imperatives. Doc Harrison had become the center's chief veterinarian, her expertise in treating both domestic and wild animals making her invaluable for caring for the military working dogs who often exhibited behaviors that fell somewhere between pet and predator. Her reports on Phoenix's psychological recovery had been published in veterinary journals, contributing to a growing understanding of how animals processed trauma and formed new attachments after experiencing loss. The children from Whitefish Elementary School often visited the center for educational programs about wildlife conservation and military service. Phoenix had become their favorite teacher, demonstrating how strength and gentleness could coexist, how intelligence could be channeled toward protection rather than aggression. Emma Thompson, now 10 and remarkably articulate about her family's wilderness experience, served as an unofficial ambassador, helping other children understand that sometimes the most frightening-looking creatures possess the gentlest hearts. Martha's presence felt stronger than ever in the expanded homestead, not as a ghost haunting Robert's memories, but as a guiding spirit whose wisdom about love and family had proven prophetic. Her garden had been restored and expanded, now tended by Sarah Thompson and Elena Rodriguez, who had discovered that growing things helped heal the wounds that talking couldn't always reach. The tomatoes Martha had loved bloomed more vibrantly than ever, as if her spirit had blessed the soil with extra fertility. As Robert watched Phoenix playing gently with the newest addition to their family, a retired military working dog named Charlie who had arrived just weeks earlier, he reflected on the journey that had brought them all together. 3 years ago, he'd been a lonely old man counting down his remaining days in isolation. Now, he was surrounded by a chosen family that included war veterans, scientists, children, and animals who had all found healing through the simple act of loving unconditionally. The phone calls from other communities seeking advice about establishing similar programs arrived weekly, each conversation reminding Robert that their little experiment in Montana had become a movement. Veterans organizations, animal welfare groups, and congressional representatives all wanted to understand how they had created something that honored both service and peace, duty and love. Phoenix seemed to understand his role as both patriarch and symbol. When photographers came to document the center's work, he posed with dignified patience, his amber eyes holding wisdom that transcended species barriers. When new animals arrived traumatized and fearful, he provided calm leadership that helped them trust again. When children visited and asked if he was dangerous, Phoenix would sit perfectly still and allow them to pet his massive head, demonstrating that true strength lay in knowing when not to use one's power. Evening had become Robert's favorite time of day, when the extended family gathered on the expanded porch to share meals and stories. Elena would read excerpts from Marcus's letters. Mike would share updates about successful placements of retired military working dogs, and the Thompson children would chatter about their school projects and friends. Phoenix would position himself where he could observe everyone, his presence a reminder that love had the power to transform even the most broken spirits into sources of healing for others. As the sun set behind the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that Martha had always loved, Robert felt a completeness that he'd never expected to experience again. Phoenix rested beside his chair, warm and solid and utterly content, the perfect embodiment of second chances and the healing power of unconditional love. "You know what you taught us, boy?" Robert said softly, his weathered hand resting on Phoenix's broad head. "You taught us that families aren't born. They're built by people and creatures who choose to love each other through whatever storms come their way." Phoenix's tail thumped once against the porch boards, a gesture of satisfaction that seemed to say he'd always known that love was the most powerful force in any universe that mattered. Dear friends, Phoenix's story reminds us that our greatest chapters often begin when we think our story is ending. At our age, society tells us to slow down, to accept less, to prepare for decline. But Phoenix and Robert show us that love doesn't diminish with age. It deepens into something more precious than gold. Sometimes what looks like a rescue becomes a mutual salvation, and sometimes the very act of caring for another heals our own wounded hearts. Your wisdom, your capacity for love, your ability to see beyond appearances, these aren't fading with time. They're becoming your superpowers. What unexpected blessing has entered your life when you thought your best days were behind you? How has opening your heart to someone or something new changed your perspective on what's possible? Share your story below. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.